What's up, y'all? Jonathan Ramirez here, Thriving Earth Farm and Development out of Jolton, Tennessee. Today I wanted to talk about lessons for home design that I've sort of garnered from seeing and observing and being in Amish and Mennonite homesteads, particularly more old order style Amish and Mennonite homesteads. I feel like they embody some of these principles a little bit more. But yeah, lots of stuff that we can gain as homesteaders, permaculturists, and just people who want to live more sustainably and more resilient. Before I get into some of the stuff on this list, I just wanted to tell a story about a homestead that I went to in Kentucky. So it was this one was my first time being in an Amish homestead. And actually they were old order Mennonites. They did not live with electricity. They used a horse and carriage. They didn't use tractors for cultivation. So they're pretty old order. Their water source came from a ram pump that filled into an above ground metal cistern, which was then gravity fed into the house. They had an outhouse, so they didn't have any sort of running water in the house really. So yeah, well, I guess they did have running water. They just they didn't have, like, pressurized city water going into the house. It was all just gravity fed. And they did have some sort of gray water septic system, but they did have an outhouse for going to the bathroom. Anyways, so I showed up to this house because this family was moving out of this house and they wanted to sell it. And part of the reason they wanted to move out of the house is because their community was actually like 3 ridges over, and there was no land available when they were starting their own family. So they bought this other property, started building things on it, putting fencing up and stuff like that. And so they made do, but they had to take these like pretty extensive trails through the forest to get to their actual community. That would take quite some time. And I think land came available within their community, and they decided they wanted to sell this property. So I went to go look at it, and one of the things that I kind of realized when I got there was that the home is actually an old English home, or a standard American home that was built, probably in the early 1900s, and it was still standing. And the Amish that lived, or the Mennonites that lived there, made a bunch of adjustments to it, built a bunch of different barns and outhouses, put up fencing and all that sort of stuff, and modified it. But the interesting thing about it is the way that that a lot of people within our community build their homes is not too different from these older English, American homes. And the reason for that being is that there's some efficiency, wisdom in it. So one of the things that I realized, first and foremost, that I thought was pretty genius is that when you walk into the house, the first floor is incredibly open. There's not a bunch of walls dividing that first story where all of the stuff happens. Like, there was a sewing station where the women and children could sew and do projects to repair things. The kitchen, the areas where they were reading books, like all the communal stuff and activities were happening all on this first floor, as well as heating the house. The wood cook stove was in there, and we'll talk more about that. But there weren't any walls. There were posts, to serve as support for the second story. But that first floor was really open. And one thing that I noticed about it is that it was, despite them not having any light bulbs in the house, like lamps or ceiling lights or anything like that, it was very well lit up. And one of the things that I really don't like about our house is that the natural sunlight that gets into the house is really poor. So it struck me when I saw this house is that there was ample sunlight in there, and there weren't a bunch of interior walls blocking sunlight from getting into different parts of that space. So the natural sunlight was really amazing. And the other thing that I realized about it too is that, one of the things that I don't like about our home is that our kitchen and living room are, together but separated by a wall, and there's kind of like a double doors worth of space between them to get from one room to another. But then to get to bedrooms and get to other parts of the house, there's a long hallway that goes back to the bedrooms. There's closets in there, there's a bathroom in there. But what we found in our situation when we're heating our space, our wood stove is in the living room, it's really hard to get that hot air back into the bedrooms. That's one of the biggest gripes that we have about our standard American single story home that we built. And what I noticed about this Mennonite home was that this big wood cook stove was the central point in this first story, and I could imagine heating up in the wintertime. The heat was able to get anywhere in that space very easily. There weren't walls blocking the heat from getting there. They weren't having to push air down long hallways to get to certain bedrooms. So I thought, hey, that's actually really smart. Like the heat can get everywhere in this space. Then I was like, well, what about getting the heat up into the actual bedrooms? Like they didn't have an HVAC, so how are they going to be getting the heat, up into those rooms? And so I was walking around and looking. I was like, can I see the upstairs? And like, oh yeah, it's right through here. And what I realized is right across from the wood cook stove, on the first sort of back wall there, there was a door that you turn the doorknob, and there was no hallway at all. There was just stairs going straight up. And I thought that was interesting. And what I also noticed is that the roof on that first, or not the roof, the ceiling on that first story was lower than your traditional ceiling. Why have the heat rise, hit that ceiling, and have to fill up more space before it gets into the space? So I was like, okay, that's interesting. The ceiling is lower. When you open up this door, into that stairwell, the ceiling actually has all that heat. And once you open up that door, it escapes right up into the stairwell. And so you walk up the stairwell, and there's no hallway once you get into the second floor. There's a landing, and that landing opens up into 4 rooms where all you do is open the door and the heat goes right in there. So I was talking to the homeowners about it, and they said, yeah, in the wintertime, we all wake up and come downstairs. Who's ever down there first stokes the wood stove, closes that door leading up the stairs, starts heating that downstairs space. They let it heat up throughout the day. Eventually they kind of quit tending it. Then when the evening starts to come around again, they start getting ready to cook dinner, and they fire up the wood stove. They start cooking dinner, and then right as everyone's about to go to bed, they open up that door, and they all go upstairs, and they open up their doors, and the heat rises and heads up into those bedrooms. The space down there doesn't stay as warm, but it allows some of that heat to go up there. And I was like, man, that's really ingenious. That's a really good design. And so it got me thinking. I was like, the way that, for example, our house is built, it's this like crazy L-shaped house, where our wood stove is right over here. And the kitchen and the living room are separated here with a large kind of opening right there. And then from here, there's basically a long hallway that comes back to the bedrooms. It's really hard to push that heat that way. And if you can let the natural rise of heat bring air up to bedrooms naturally, then you don't need a HVAC, pushing that air. One thing that we're planning on doing in our house is putting the HVAC intake right by the wood stove and making it so that when the HVAC kicks on, it pulls the hot air that's rising above the wood stove and gets blown by the HVAC into these back rooms. So that's something that we're working on. It still requires electricity, it still requires the use of the HVAC, but it allows the HVAC to utilize the wood heat even more. So anyways, I thought their heating system was really super interesting, and I thought there was a lot of value to learning from it. So all that being said, you know, like L-shape, another like common thing that you'll see in Amish homesteads is they're a simple shape, and they're a simple shape for the reason that I just told you partially. Sometimes you will see a bunch of like additions added on, but usually those additions are generally not what you think, and sometimes have different elements to them, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But yeah, that simple shape of that homestead was, you know, just like this. Boom. An additional benefit of having that simple shape in the house is that your roof line is generally super simple. It's you know, just two planes and that's it. And that's easy for building, that's easy for maintenance. But we'll talk more about that in a little bit. I just want to keep going with the story. So anyways, I went up to the second story of the house, saw how the rooms up there were laid out. Thought it was pretty ingenious that the heat could just rise into those rooms. And then I asked them, you know, is there an attic? What type of insulation is in the house? And they had some sort of, believe it or not, they had some sort of blown-in cellulose insulation. It wasn't fiberglass bats. It was some sort of, you know, blown-in material. I didn't get a good look at it. Part of the reason I didn't get a good look at it is because when we went into the attic, which they said they did have an attic, so we went up there, we climbed the ladder from that landing into the attic. When we got up into the attic, one thing I noticed was that there was insulation between, you know, the ceiling joists, and but the insulation was barely visible because there were mountains of clothes. They weren't Amish clothes, they were English clothes they must have got from an estate sale or, you know, some sort of secondhand shop or something like that. But there was clothing piled on top of the insulation as a second layer of insulation on the house. I thought that was super interesting. It made me realize that insulation for Amish and Mennonite families is quite important, especially when you don't have the HVAC. And in Tennessee and Kentucky, especially in the summertime. One thing that people kind of get wrong about Tennessee and Kentucky is everyone's like very obsessed with passive solar. And while that's good to have, and it's good for natural sunlight, it's good for heating your home, it's actually not as important as it would be, you know, in New York and Vermont and Maine and, you know, northern Ohio and Iowa and Minnesota and colder climates. Here, really the hardest part is staying cool in the summertime. So insulation is really important for that. And there's a few other things that they capitalize on in Amish and Mennonite homesteads in our area, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that really helps with that. So anyways, they had clothing for insulation on top of that layer, and the walls, he said they had good insulation. At some point in time, they had gutted the house, put new insulation in, and redone the interior and the siding of the house. The interior of the house was just not drywall, plywood, and the outside was metal roofing. Really good quality metal roofing. One thing that you'll see that's really common with Amish and Mennonite homesteads is metal siding and metal roofing is quite common, and they will often go for standing seam, but if they can't do standing seam, they'll just go with, you know, traditional exposed fastener, you know, metal roofing and siding. Maybe back in the day you would have seen, you know, more clapboard siding and shingle siding and stuff like that, but pretty much every single Amish and Mennonite homestead that I've seen has metal roofing and siding. Occasionally you'll see vinyl. And anyways, so that's something that struck me as well. The other thing that I thought was really interesting is going back downstairs and going back to the kind of kitchen area, is that they had a kitchen that was, they had their regular kitchen inside the house that was in the main first floor area, but they also had a kitchen that was off to the side. Like, let's say this is the house looking from above. There was a kitchen on, is it the west or east side of the house? I can't exactly remember, but it was a room just like that had double doors. I did that wrong. Double doors over here, and this door entered into the house, and it was pretty close to the kitchen. I thought that was interesting because they had a wood stove in here for cooking, and they also had a wood stove in here for cooking. But this space was very compartmentalized. And the reason for that being is that in the summertime when you're cooking, you can't cook inside a house because you will just fry everybody in the house, and you cannot keep the house cool that way. So they had this outdoor kitchen or compartmentalized kitchen off the side of the house. The garden, north, south, east, yeah, so that was on the east side of the house. The garden was right over here on the south side of the house. They had a door from the kitchen leading right out to it. They had a door over here going to a long northern porch. And there was only about 2 foot worth of awning space, covered space coming out from this wall before you got to the garden. I thought that was interesting. Normally what I would think is that, or what I had been originally thinking is like, yeah, you want a south-facing house with a nice big porch so you can sit on the porch and get, warmed up in the spring and the fall, and, but what I realized is that in the wintertime, when the sun is low in the sky, if you have a really long south-facing porch, less sunlight is going to be getting into the interior of your house. And the reason that I know that is because we have a really long 25-foot carport on the south side of our house, and in the wintertime, sunlight does not get into the house. So they have a really short south-facing porch for ample sunlight coming in. They have a really long north-facing porch. And there's a huge wood stack over here. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And also, there was actually a strong west-facing porch, covered porch here as well. This was covered, this was covered. So west and north, very covered. And I was wondering about that, and I realized in the wintertime, most of your cold weather and your snow, we do have snow and snow drifts here in Tennessee and in Kentucky. The snow drifts and the cold weather comes in from the north and west. What's more is that I was like, well, why didn't they put the, wood cook stove, like an outdoor wood cook stove right here on the west side? And I was thinking that it's because that evening sun in the summertime that's in the west is really brutal. You would much rather have, eastern sun peering in, morning sun peering in through these double doors than you would to have, like, be cooking in the evening and just be getting blasted by the oppressive, evening sun. So they had their wood stack here, which means that it would stay fairly dry. And if snowdrift came in a little bit, it wouldn't come all the way to the wood stack. And also in the summertime, if, folks are hanging out in this back porch, it's not so hot. You have some protection from this, western porch as well. I just thought the orientation and the sizing of the porches and the covered roofs on the porches was just really ingenious. I thought that was a really smart move, and the way that they had it laid out was, super sensible. Going back to this area here, they had their wood cook stove right over here, but their kitchen, wash station and food preparing station was right here, and there were a bunch of windows on this wall. And I forget where the stairwell was at, but I think the stairwell was right over here, and it was enclosed, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Oh no, we already spoke about the heat going up there. Yeah. So it was enclosed, the stairwell went up there and went up into the rooms. And then this was the garden area. And not only that, but in the garden area, there was actually, or going out to the garden area, there was like a door right here, and there was a shed right here. So this kind of goes to permaculture zones of use. You have your kitchen, and right out your door, literally right out your door, you have your kitchen garden. That's so smart. So the coolest thing about this one is that you would walk out the door, turn to your left, there was a shed you could grab a garden hoe from, or pruning shears or a basket or something, and then with your next step, you were literally in the garden. And I just thought that was ingenious. And then on this wall, someone could be doing dishes or cutting and be looking right out into the garden. They actually had a really long crop field over here, but from what it looked like, it was more of like a staple crop field. And then over here, there was a beam coming off the house with swings on it. The beam was coming off the house with, like an A-frame at the end of it, and there were swings on it. So whoever was over here cooking, or if someone was in the garden, they could be gardening or cooking and watching their kids swing. So it's just like, man, this is all just like really super smart and sensible. So going back to, the permaculture zones of use, the garden was right there, the crop field was right there. They did have fruit trees kind of scattered around this side of the house, and there was like a line of fruit trees going this way that they hadn't planted themselves, but they were quite old, and I wasn't sure if they were like still in production or not. One of the other things I thought was really interesting was on this northern side of the house. This was actually where like the entrance to the house was. Also, like the road twisted up from over here and came to the front, and there were a number of outbuildings all on this north side of the house, and the road came through and looped back out that way, which also I think is really sensible. If you're gonna have a garden to your south, or if you're gonna be having a bunch of outbuildings, you don't want to put a bunch of outbuildings right to the south side of your garden, because it's the same reason why you wouldn't plant really tall trees on the south side of your garden, is because it hurts your winter sunlight. So I thought it was good. These outbuildings also protected cold winds from coming in on the north side of the house. One of them was firewood, one of them was for the horse and buggy, and what was the other one for? I think it was just tool storage or something. They did have a shop over here somewhere on the east side of the house, which I believe was actually for one of their teenagers. And the other cool thing that I noticed was that over here on this side of the house, over here, I think there was another one kind of like right over here, there were 3 enormous sugar maple trees. And when I noticed that, it really struck me, because I realized that I have seen that a ton on old homesteads, not just Amish and Mennonite homesteads, but also really old, early English homesteads. Like, I can walk or I can drive around this neighborhood here in Joelton, Tennessee, and find old farmhouses that have been converted and updated, and people are living in them with big old sugar maples around them. And you have to ask yourself and wonder why. And it makes total sense. In the summertime, these sugar maple trees, cast an enormous deep shade over the house, helping cool the tree down. You could do that with other trees, but sugar maples really cast a super dense shade. What that does is it makes maintenance around this part of your house very minimal. but it also cools the house down. Then in the wintertime, these trees are deciduous, so they're going to lose their leaves, and they're going to allow that sunlight back in, and then they can tap the trees if they want, and the trees are right there. Obviously 3-4 big sugar maple trees aren't going to yield a huge like business level amount of maple water, but it's enough to tap to drink good high rich maple water, or to do, you know, a few small sugaring burns. So anyways, I thought that was really smart having those sugar maple trees around the house, and I thought that was just really super genius. And then yeah, I think that was kind of it for my walk around there. We were really interested in buying this homestead and moving our farm to this location. It was over 70 acres with a few different things. It was other parts of the property which were pasture, were fenced and cross-fenced, and there were other barns located in other areas for hay storage. It was just a really good setup.